So a lot of people have been requesting for this video, which is a guide on summoning for memories and also a tier list for each one of them. And that's what this video is going to be about. Now, I will obviously be going through the tier list for memory by position, because once again, you want to equip the right memory on the character or on the right position in order to actually activate its effect. If you equip it on the wrong position, you would only be able to get benefit from the raw stat, but you won't actually be able to activate its effect. So that's kind of why I'm only going to do my tier list by position. However, before actually showing you guys the tier list, I kind of want to talk about which one should actually be summoning for. And the answer is simple: you should always be summoning on this UR banner. Okay, don't summon on this, don't summon on this. Yes, some of those SSR memory is going to look good, but no, the best one is definitely going to be the UR one. And just to show you guys, I definitely preach what I teach. If you take a look at my recruit history, you can see that the pity is only 100, okay, for UR memory. I already got that at 83, and what am I doing? I'm still summoning on this UR banner, okay? Even though I know I definitely won't hit pity the second time around, I'm still summoning and trying to get lucky. And that's basically because the UR memory are going to be so much more useful than all of the SSR memory. Now, what is the reason you want to summon for the UR memory? Even though if you actually take a look at price info, you won't even get any SSR here. The reason why you want to summon for the UR one is because they give higher raw stat. It's just a simple stat. Even if I don't take take use of its actual active effect, the raw stats is going to be more than enough to justify the reason for it. Because the raw stats, I haven't done the pure calculate, like the complete calculation, but it's probably going to be somewhere around 10 to 15% higher than an SSR of the same value. And if you actually put this on a character, you can think of translating to basically an SSR memory with a constant 15% buff, right? That by itself is already going to be much more useful than a lot of SSR memories at lower dupes. So that's kind of why you are just going to be good purely for its pure raw stats perspective. Not to mention this Ushijima one, the actual active effect for it is really good as well, which I'll talk about in the actual tier list itself. But yeah, right now, if you are considering which memory to summon for, it should 100% be going to the UR memory. Now, if you do not want to go all out, for example, if you just want to get one copy, then that's fine, and then stop and save up for the next UR memory. I am doing this because I know this memory is it's going to be a lot more useful than some of the other UR memory in the future. So that's kind of why I'm going all out. But as a basic rule, definitely go for the UR if possible, okay? It's just going to be much more valuable than the SSR. The other reason is also good to go min-max into a UR memory. It's going to be for the fact that vast majority of the time, you wouldn't even have the resources to level up multiple memory. Because when you actually farm in the very different stages, you will be prioritizing your characters, you will be prioritizing your training manual, and towards the end game, you'll be prioritizing getting the right potential substats, etc. Farming for memory experience is probably one of the last thing you'll be doing, and as a result, you won't actually have too much experience to go all out and actually level up multiple of your memories. So that's kind of why actually min-maxing and just focusing on a few good memories, such as those UR one, is going to be really worthwhile as well. And also the other reason, which will also become very obvious when I show you the tier list later on, is that actually there are quite a lot of really good SR memories in this game as well. So you can definitely get by with 1 or 2 UR memory and then fill in the gap with SR memory rather than going all out for 7 SSR. Okay, let's start off with the tier list for mid blockers. And for the S tier, you can actually see I separate out into 2 levels. One's going to be universal, which basically means that memory can work on anyone. And then the second level is going to be specific. So those memory are still going to be very good, still S tier, but you'll only get the most out of it if you actually put it on specific characters. Okay, so starting off at the top, the universal one is going to be this one with Aeon's picture on. This one is great because of the fact that its effects are actually very straightforward, very simple to activate. Whenever you do a block, if it's not bad, then you are actually able to reduce the opponent's spike stamina. Now, this is going to be good because the block, you just basically activate it whenever you do a block. It doesn't even have to be a blocking skill. So even if you put on someone such as Hinata, who doesn't even have a blocking skill, you're able to activate that effect. So that's kind of why this one just universally good. Then we move on to the next one, which is going to be for specific character, which is Suki's one. This one's probably the second best memory in my opinion, because it does still give a very high raw buff to your blocking stat. However, the second half of the effect actually requires the opponent to have a debuff on, which basically means that your mid blocker or maybe your team need to have a way of actually landing that debuff in the first place. So that's kind of what's going to be a bit more specific than how to actually activate the one for Aeon. Then we move on to the one for Hinata. This one increase your crit rate, however, at the expense of your own blocking stat. So this is kind of why it's only going to be useful for mid blockers who only do attacks rather than defense. So that's kind of why it's going to be very specific. Then this one was Kuro's picture on. This one is basically you're able to increase both offensive wise and also defense. The offense you increase it by your crit rate, and then defensively you're able to increase your block stat. However, it's by the amount of your crit damage. So it actually requires you build your character in a certain way, and also require your character to be both good offensively and also defensively to really make the use of both half of the effect. So that's kind of why it's going to be a bit more specific as well. And then the last one is going to be the surfing one for Yamaguchi. It doesn't do anything else other than surfing, but it's the best one for surfers. So that's kind of why you still want it at S tier for specific characters such as Yamaguchi. Now let's move on to the A tier. Starting off with the one on Leaf. This one's a bit weird one in the sense that the only buff it's able to provide to itself is actually when your teammate do a perfect receive, which makes it very, very conditional because first of all, you need to keep hold of your, let's say your ultimate quick spike, and also you have to wait for your teammate actually to do a perfect receive. So that's kind of why I don't really like the buff on itself. However, what the better ones are actually able to do is actually increase the receiving stats for your entire back row. And that can be very, very useful for a Nekoma team. But outside of Nekoma team, I probably don't see much use of it. So that's kind of why it's only going to be for 80. Then this one, which everyone can exchange from the SSR shop. Basically, this is a free SSR. However, you can only increase your offensive attack rather than defense. So that's kind of why it's going to be very biased towards certain characters. And that's kind of why it's only going to be for 80 as well. And then this one, this is actually an SR memory, which is actually very decent because it does actually increase your blocking stat. However, it does take time for you to actually stack up 5 levels of the buff. But once you actually stack up all 5, it's actually going to be even higher than what Suki is able to do. So it's definitely very good, but it just take that time for it to actually reach that level. So that's kind of why, once again, it's only at 80. And then last one, this is not a really weird memory in the sense that the first half of the effect is able to buff your quick spike ultimate, then the second half is able to buff your blocking ultimate. But all of the characters in this game only have one ultimate, right? Which basically means even though this can go pretty much on any mid blocker, all of the mid blocker out there can only use half of his ability as well. So that's kind of why it's only going to be in the B tier for me. Now let's move on to the Wind Spike tier list, which is a straightforward SAB tier. Starting off the one for Tanaka, this one is able to provide a constant buff to your power spike and also further boost your first 2 spike of the match, which makes it useful regardless whether you're playing on your main focal point for scoring or maybe more like a secondary spiker who is only going to spike every now and then. So that just makes him universally good on all of the characters. So that's why he's top of S tier. Then the second memory here is going to be the one you can change in the shop for free. This one, the stats is not going to be as good as what Tanaka is able to provide. However, you're actually able to weaken the enemy's blocking stats instead. And also you can last for 2 net crossing. So that can be very interesting when you're facing more like blocking oriented teams. So that's kind of why it's still good enough to be on S tier. And then the last one is it's an SR memory. First of all, this is for the practice version of Iwazumi rather than the school uniform one. And this one is able to increase crit rate. Now, obviously the stats is not going to be as high as the SSR one, both in terms of its effect and also in terms of raw stat. However, the thing with this game is that a lot of times your skills actually have effects which is conditional on you actually landing a crit. So increasing crit rate is actually going to be very, very important, not just for extra damage, but also for fulfilling and also activating additional ability. So that's kind of why this is also deserving of S tier, especially because it's only an SR memory as well. I think it's definitely one of the best memory in the game. Now moving on to the A tier, the first one is the one for Asahi. This one, to be honest, is just going to be straight off a worse version of the Tanaka one, because first of all, the first half of its ability, you're only able to activate it when your stamina is more than 50, which vast majority of the time, which just means the first 2 spike of the match, which is exactly the same as what Tanaka is able to provide. However, Tanaka does have a constant buff, which is always going to be on as well, whereas Asahi's one doesn't. So that's kind of what, from buffing perspective, this is just going to be worse than Tanaka. And then the second half of the effect only going to be activated when your spike actually consumes some stamina, which once again is going to be make it very specific to Asahi. So that's kind of why it's just not going to be as universally good as what Tanaka's one is able to provide, and just a worse version of it. Okay, and then the next one we have the one which is surfing. Now this is only going to be used for wind spiker that you'll be using not for spiking purposes, but solely for surfing purposes. So for example, like a pinch server for wind spiking position. But for that kind of position, this is going to be the best memory you can put on them. So that's kind of why he's going to be on the A tier. Then for this one, which is for the school uniform version of Iwatayumi, this actually increases your receiving stats, which can make it a bit interesting for you actually want to put on wind spike, which is more defensive oriented. Right now, we don't actually have many, but in the future, there will be a couple more. So that can potentially be useful in the future, but right now, I can only put it in the A tier. And then this one is kind of similar, but it's for more blocking wind spiker, which once again, right now, we only have one, which is Futakuchi. So that's kind of why this is only going to be in the A tier as well. And then the last one, we have the one for Enoshita, which kind of increase your defensive technique. So that's kind of like a weaker version of what Iwatayumi or Futakushi's one is able to provide. So that's kind of why this is only in the B tier. Okay, so tier list for the setters is going to look something like this. At the top, we have this memory, which first of all provide constant buff, and second of all, the trigger condition for the second half of the effect is going to be very straightforward. You just don't have to have a bad block, so as long as it's normal or perfect, you can trigger, and it's actually quite nice buff as well. So that's kind of why this is going to be good. And then for the ones on the A tier, they are decent, but they kind of require very specific character. So if we take a look at the one with Orakawa's picture on, this one you're able to increase the attack tempo, but vast majority of the time, unless you actually play someone from their school, otherwise you won't even be able to stack up attack tempo. So that's kind of why it's very specific. And then this one on Kageyama, you are able to increase both of your setter dump and also your surfing skill. So once again, you kind of require a character who is able to perform both type of skills, which make it very specific as well. Then we're moving on to the B tier. This is going to be the one that you can exchange from the shop. To be honest, it's not bad, but the stats buff is able to provide just so much lower in comparison to other SSR that is kind of just not worth it in my opinion. And then on the C tier, we basically have all of the SR ones. Now, all of them do slightly different things. So this one, for example, is able to increase your set stat. This one's more for serving. This one's more for increasing the defensive capability of your back row. So they all do something slightly different, which can make it a bit of like a budget replacement if you don't have one for the SSR one. For the opposite hidden memory, opposite top of the tier is going to be this UR memory for Ushijima, right? You increase both your crit rate and also crit damage, but absolutely great. So definitely S tier for that. Then on the A tier, I'll have first off the one for Kantara. You're able to do a bit of a supporting passive in the sense that you will be increasing off your power spike labeled characters crit damage. So that's kind of be quite good already. Like even if your own opposite hitter is not actually of power spike label, this is still going to be very useful as a supporting skill. On top of that, you're also able to do a debuff as well. So this is just very good regardless which opposite hitter you are going to have. And then this one is basically like this is only an SR memory first of all, and this is basically like a budget version of the Ushijima one. You increase your crit damage and also increase your crit rate. So it's essentially just another version of the Ushijima one, but obviously with lower stats and lower buff. Then moving on to the B tier, this one requires both, buff both power spike and also blocking stats. However, obviously not too many characters. Well, there's only one opposite hitter right now in the game which actually have blocking ability. So that's kind of why it's not going to be very universally useful. Then we have this one for Daichi, well, with Daichi's picture on, you're able to increase your own receiving stat, which is quite decent. You are also able to passively buff up your power spiker, however, only when they consume 20 stamina. So it's going to be a very, very small buff to your other characters. So that's kind of why I don't actually value it as much as this one for Kantara. And then we have this one, which is for the practice version of Daichi, so an SR memory. This one is nice, but it kind of requires you to actually do a receive first in order to in order to buff your next power spike. However, the same in this game is that you can't control who's going to do the receive, and it's not always going to be Daichi or whoever your opposite hitter actually receiving the ball. So that's kind of why it's not going to be as useful, and it's going to be a bit more down to RNG if you do actually use this memory. And then lastly, we have this one for Kantara. Now this is going to be only for surfing purposes. So if you actually want to play a pinch server for opposite header, but to be all honesty, opposite header is not normally the one that you would do use a pinch server for. You normally use it for mid blocker or maybe even wind spiker. Normally it's going to be mid blocker, to be honest. So that's kind of why I don't actually see as much value of having a pinch server memory for opposite header. And also in terms of actual servers, in terms of for opposite header, you basically have Kentaro and also Yushijima, and both though, to be honest, vast majority of the time you actually want them to do some spikes, not just serves, so they would not be the best choice for this memory anyway. So that's kind of why this memory is a bit awkward, even though it can be in theory good for any pinch servers. And then lastly, we have this free SSR that you can get from the shop. The buff is okay, but only lasts for 3 turns, I believe. So it's going to be very, very short duration and just makes it not worthwhile. And lastly, let's do the liberal memory, which as you can see, there aren't actually that many. For the S tier, we have two which are actually very similar in terms of effect. This is the SSR you can get from the shop. This is only an SR memory. Now, both of them have an effect which can only be activated when you receive it's not bad, which to be honest is quite common. And then what's going to do is it's going to buff your next spike. Now, this SSR one is only able to buff it for power spike, whereas this SR one is able to do it for both power and also quick spike. And in fact, the buff is able to provide is even higher than the SSR one. However, as a compensation, this one doesn't actually provide any stats to the liberal himself, whereas this SSR one are actually able to provide some stats increase to the liberal himself. And also, obviously, SSR have better raw stats than the SR version. So that's kind of why, as a whole, I would say on balance, they're both on the same tier. Now, moving on to the A tier, it's going to be the 2 memory for Nishinoya. Now, this SSR one is good, but only if you actually put it on Nishinoya, because one of its trigger activation for this effect is that you actually need to use the receive skill, which consumes stamina, which right now in the game, I think Nishinoya is the only one, so that's kind of why you kind of need to put down Nishinoya. But if you do that, it's actually a very good memory for him. But obviously, I will penalize it for the fact that it's not going to be universally useful on other liberal in the future. And then this one, which is the SR version for Nishinoya, is just able to provide some basic stats. And also, once again, if you don't have actually a bad receive, you're able to activate some additional effects. So that's kind of why it's also decent and actually universally good on other liberal as well. And then lastly, we have this one. It's able to provide some constant stats, but the other half of its effect can only be activated when the opponent actually uses a quick spike, so it's a bit more restricted than this one from Nishinoya. So that's kind of why I moved it to the B tier.